Hi, I'm Milla and welcome to another Milla's Game Room video. This time around we're going to be talking about importing, which is a really popular topic among video game communities, especially here in the 2020s, and collecting being all the rage these days. The kids and the adults, but mainly the adults, collecting video games. But there are also a lot of things we need to talk about regarding importing, and that includes the fundamental question on the title of this video. Should we really be importing video games to begin with? First of all, before jumping in, algorithm boosting stuff, please like, comment, subscribe, etc. and so forth. And become a channel member, etc. That's all that there. So let's get straight into it. So I want to start with a bit of an anecdote because I've had a tradition in my own game collecting life that has been running for a very long time, for at least, probably almost 10 years now, where for my birthday and my Christmas, I would usually get money from family and I would import video games of it, as well as related merchandise. I've imported both, ranging from US imports right the way through to Japanese exclusive OSTs and art books, which I love doing. It's a great way to pick up stuff and add to my collection. I've even unboxed a few things on the channel that I've imported, and of course played stuff. It's how I played through like Steam Prison on the Switch, got Dragon Quest games on the 3DS, I've got a ton of other things which I'm going to be referencing throughout the video, because importing has been an optimal part of my experiences as an enthusiast of video games, because I think a lot of people, they don't understand or fully grasp importing and the various nuances around it. So a few disclaimers before jumping in. I'm not going to critique individual sellers, especially smaller creators and other individuals who rely on affiliate earnings to get by, because under late stage capitalism, if you're a content creator, affiliate links are a great way to have passive income. So if I was large enough, I would consider the same thing. I'm not going to blame people who do that. I'm focusing on video games as well, so not limited editions, no merchandise, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. I'm just focusing on video games today. Finally, some things I will say do apply to merchandise, as well as exclusive items in Western editions, because a lot of limited editions, even now in 2024-25, will be for items that we don't get in Europe or North America, or vice versa, which as a European I can relate to, but we'll come back to that. So, let's start from the beginning. How did the import scene even get started? So in the 1990s and 2000s, importing was still a fairly inaccessible concept. This is partly because restrictions on global trade, but also because people didn't know much about region exclusive titles to begin with, or what's even coming to North America and Europe. There are of course gaming magazines, but primarily carried the news back in the day. Sometimes it would be Tormac titles that we would get, they were coming to Japan but not confirmed for the West, or titles that were planned to come for a Western release in both North America, Europe, or vice versa, but then for reasons not stated, it never happens. There are multiple cases like this. As someone who grew up in the late 2000s and early 2010s who really loved video game magazines, one example I think of is Official Nintendo Magazine, UK, where they talked about Dragon Quest games, and that included Dragon Quest X when that was first revealed for the Nintendo Wii, and later the Dragon Quest games on the Nintendo 3DS, such as Simon Mori, Dragon Quest 3, and Terry's 1M 3D. Both of them are games that I now own physically, alongside the rest of the Japan exclusive Dragon Quest 3DS games that are on a cartridge anyway. I don't have DQX, and I'm not paying over $100 for a cardboard, but that's beside the point. They were parts of my import experience, and a lot of other people too, if you were into the 3DS. As the internet became more popular, knowledge of Japanese exclusives spread thanks to globalization, as well as publishers re-releasing older games or releasing sequels or newer entries in the West for the first time, where the previous games previously got overlooked. An example of this is the Summer Night series, where we only got the 5th mainline Summer Night game released in English after the first 4 games were not released here, and only some of the spin-offs were. That's one example, but there are loads of other examples of niche series like that. Sakura Wars is another example. Great game, by the way, on the PS2/Nintendo Wii. Check it out, I love it. Moreover, fans acquired the means to acquire physical games from sites like PlayAsia, YesAsia, Game, and Amazon Japan. Another factor that really helped the import scene grow was the decline of region locking. Now, this is quite an alien concept for most people, unless you live in China anyway, where there's still region locking. But older systems were region locked. It was standard for old home console systems, except handhelds, to be region locked, so you'd have to buy a game released specifically for your region. If you're a younger gamer, the most recent example of this will be the Nintendo 3DS, because Nintendo decided for a really, we don't know why, but they decided to region lock the games, so you couldn't buy them yet. The DS stuff played just fine. I've played Japanese games on my European DS and vice versa. They work fine, but yet Nintendo were like, we'll just region lock it, no one's gonna care. But spoiler alert, they did care, and it was really weird. And already made Nintendo a massive outlier at the time, which is quite ironic considering the Nintendo Switch is one of the most region-friendly consoles in gaming history. And it was easy ever to import or even just buy digital games. But as for home consoles, the region locking started to be removed for those with the PlayStation 3 era, and to a lesser extent the Xbox 360, and it was only once Nintendo released the Switch that they fully abandoned region locking, because all their prior systems to the Switch were region locked in terms of home consoles. There are other examples too, but that's generally how it is. As I mentioned a bit earlier, it's no longer a thing outside of China, and the reason why there's region locking in China, I believe, relates to government restrictions there with the CCP and various other barriers to releasing stuff in China. Like, you've got to team up with a Chinese company, which is what Nintendo and Tencent do with the Switch, for example. It's a whole different can of worms, and if you live in China, you probably just import from outside the region anyway, because there is a massive grey market there and you can just import anything. It's a bit weird and out of the scope of this video. Of course, as I mentioned, there were import sellers that started to establish themselves early on. Yes Asia was the first one, who appeared in 1998. PlayAsia, the most well-known example of all the import sites, followed in 2002. And you've got other sites like Ninden Game in 2006, and then various other independent sellers across eBay and various other platforms. And of course, Amazon Japan and Surugaya, forwarding services like Buyee. There's so many and they all exist now. It's quite impressive in some ways. Of course, that's only for Japan and to a lesser extent Asia. We need to talk about the theme Asian English releases, and what exactly are they? Asian English releases in a nutshell are physical releases of video games that have an English language option. In the past, these were mostly associated with Southeast Asia, but also existed in Japan as well. And go back further than a lot of people think. A lot of people associate Asian English releases with PlayStation 4, the Switch, and to a lesser extent the Vita, but there were some older titles. One example is Final Fantasy III's remake on the PSP, which didn't get a Western release, although the DS version did. Another example is the Nintendo DS version of Chrono Trigger. The Japanese version has multi-language support, which makes it the most accessible option for people looking to get their game physically now, because in the West it is really expensive. And I should know, I got one of those copies. Other examples on the PlayStation 3 included Night in the Rain, or Rain as it's known in Asia, which Sony published there as a standalone physical, and of course Okami HD, which, prior to the Nintendo Switch version becoming a hot shortly after imports, there was the PS3 remaster. There are other examples too, but I'm not going to go into those here. These releases usually contain the exact same text and localization as the North American and European releases, whether they get digital at all or get physical later, that's what happened. And this of course started to change in the 2010s. Now PlayAsia did an article on this, and to make things a bit quicker and easier to condense, I'm just going to sum up some key points here. Asia was mostly a PC only market historically, but the console market began to grow a lot there in recent years. This is partly because English is the lingua franca there. Countries like Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and depending on where you stand, Taiwan and Hong Kong too, they use English to communicate with each other. It's very similar to other parts of the world, like there's someone who lives in Europe and speaks English. If you go to pan-European events, they're all going to speak English there as a shared lingua franca, and maybe even potentially French as well, and German and Spanish, depending on where you are. There are many examples of this, Latin America as well, Africa, various depending on colonial history. There's so many examples, but what's relevant here to video games in Southeast Asia is the most popular language is of course English. Another factor is that there was inadequate infrastructure for digital distribution, meaning that physical copies were a necessity for publishers, so they had to make a physical version even when they wouldn't want to. I guess if you're a Westerner, the best example to compare this to is the lack of cloud infrastructure, which is why cloud gaming is not really caught on. PlayAsia also mentioned that publishers have the sales figures to show that Asian English physicals are necessary, but also in the West they can afford to go digital only because they know Western consumers by and large don't mind, and that's what a lot of collectors find hard to deal with. A popular example of this is Capcom. where if you live in Europe, you're probably not going to get a Capcom game physically much anymore, especially if you're on the Switch, because only their biggest titles will get physicals here. And even then, it's been a bit weird where PS4 versions would get physicals in Europe, but not in North America and vice versa. It's really weird, and that's what these decisions are. It's just so strange. This is where Asian English releases come in, because there are multiple reasons why a company would want to release their games in Asia in English physically. This is primarily for Japanese games, but other Asian companies like Softstar and H2 Interactive have also had benefits from this as well. For both Asian developed games, Japanese games getting localized, as well as physical releases of Western games that aren't in the West. All these factors can all lower the cost of a localization or release, making it justifiable. Some examples include licensing costs, lower localization costs, so age ratings, physical copies, QA submission fees, you only need to do them for an Asian release rather than North American or European. Production costs for the games, both in terms of programming the games and the physical cartridges and discs. Depending on the game, controversies as well, which there's a whole section of that I'm going to have later. You can probably guess what I mean by that. And of course, thanks to the decline of region locking, publishers were able to start taking advantage of it. In the mid-2010s, it was only really the PlayStation Vita and the PS4 that were really utilising the import scene at first, thanks to the region lock on the 3DS. And to think, if Nintendo made the 3DS region free, we could have got some 3DS exclusives in Asia. That would have been really cool, actually, but at least we got fan translations now. I think, as this article was written back in 2017, some things will have changed since then, like mentioned the unbanning in China, but also that digital sales have become a bit more evenly split across the world, but that includes Asia as well. Not universal, but it does happen. There's some games will just get digital only over there as well, but it really does depend. But generally, physical games will still be there. So what are some examples of games that were well known in the mid-2010s for their physical only status in Asia? Let's start with some exclusives, and they generally fall into two categories: licensed games and fan service games. Yep, the dreaded fan service. But starting with licensing and games that would later go on to get Western releases in some form, whether it's these games or the sequels. Gundam Breaker 3, the original third game in the Gundam Breaker spin-off series. We got the fourth game recently in the West. Super Robot Wars 5 and X, and even OG The Moon Dwellers, multiple of these games, all Gundam, all with licensing. 5 and X and OG Moon Dwellers were not released in the West, but they do exist in Asia. And of course, Taiko Drum Session. This is the PS4 Taiko game that originally got a physical release in Asia with a different translation, but was then updated for the West when Bandai Namco decided to release that here with the Switch version later on. The second example is, of course, fan service games. The most notable examples here is Dead or Alive Extreme 3. This had a huge controversy back in the day because Koei Tecmo, one of the things that was cited was because they wanted to avoid controversy releasing Dead or Alive Extreme 3 here. That was the reason, so they used it to sell this Asian English release, which, true to their word, they never released it over here. You only can import it from Asia. Yeah, there's that. The original Vita version of Murray Chronicle, which later did come west on Switch and PC, was also exclusive to Asia, so if you want to have your Vita and turn it on the side like an inappropriate toy, you have to buy the Vita version, and that was localized by Sony. If anyone's a bit confused, yeah, Sony really did localize games like that in the past. Another example is also Bullet Girls Fantasia, which was also marketed as an Asian English release, which I think that came to Steam eventually, but if you want it on consoles, you gotta get it in Asia. So before going into the video, I want to touch a bit on USA and Europe import exclusives. So my focus here is going to be as an EU collector or person who grew up in Europe and bought video games from the US and Asia, but mostly the US in terms of exclusives. Now, it's generally been cheaper for Europeans and anyone else in the PAL region who has money, so that includes Australians, minority of Middle Easterns and Africans, people from these regions who are rich as well. It was often cheaper to import American copies and to buy European copies, or they'd be able to get it from a distributor. I know in the Middle East it can be really strange where companies will get games from both regions in stock. It's really weird, or even their own release, like Nintendo did those with the 3DS. But in terms of older releases, historically a lot of NA localizations were a lot of classic JRPGs and visual novels. In Europe we didn't get many of these games, so things like Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Super Mario RPG, so many others. Groundlands of Generations, a whole bunch of old Atlas localizations where they did for the North American region, didn't come to Europe. There's so many examples. If you're a fan of JRPGs, you've probably imported from the US. If you're a fan of visual novels in the early days, you probably imported as well, like Hakoki and Sweet Views. If they got digital only releases, that'd be it until like the Vita's life cycle and we get more of them. It's the exact reasons are a bit unclear. Part of it would be smaller market. Part of it would also be PlayStation requiring multiple languages like English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, also known as the Multi-5, which it's Europe, it makes a lot of sense to want those languages, but it's also not commercially viable for a lot of these smaller games to only be in these languages. It's very different now, where even smaller languages like Dutch and Brazilian Portuguese will get native localizations, and even Russian as well. There's so many other examples, hence an import scene would build up for US imports, which helped boost a business case for these localization companies to start releasing games in America themselves, or in Europe themselves. So Groundlands is an example where, although Groundlands of Generations was not released in Europe at all, even though there was interest, we did get Heritage of War, and we also got Wayfarer of Time digitally too. Atlas as well. Even during the DS, PSP, 3DS and Vita days, this is when the import scene really kicked off for those consoles, because we knew about these games. Atlas and Axis were the main parties that they'd release games on handhelds but not release them physically in Europe, if at all. So people were used to importing that stuff. Some games didn't come at all, like Hexy's Force from Sting, which is one of the most expensive PSP games. That never got a digital European release. And even now, in 2024, it's still cheaper to import American games for some things, even if they're expensive. One example is Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse, where even if I wasn't lucky enough to get that during VGP's 30th anniversary sale, it would have still been cheaper to buy from the US. A couple of years ago, I did a video where I talked about price comparisons between North American 3DS games and European 3DS games for my channel, which was done in light of the eShop closure, that was an interesting video. I don't plan to do anything more like that, but I'm going to link that if you want to watch it, because it's real-world examples of how prices can vary between regions, even for the same game. So even if games are available in both regions that aren't import exclusives, it's still cheaper to import. Of course, it's worth mentioning that Europe also got exclusives of their own. Not so much RPGs and VNs. We got a few like Terranigma, for example, that only came out in Europe back on Yes and Yes. North America never got that game. Twinbee, which was the original version of Konami's classic shooter, that came to Europe, but not North America. Another Code R on the Nintendo Wii, that came to Europe, but not America. Of course, you got even more odd titles like Doshin the Giants on GameCube, which was the enhanced version of the 64DD game. That came to Europe, but not North America. It's really interesting seeing what happened between regions and which companies released what here, so it's worth looking into that yourself. Times have changed a lot. So what is the status of the import scene in 2024? In a nutshell, it continues to grow. More and more companies are embracing the import model to an extent, ranging from companies like Square Enix and Capcom, to even companies who usually don't do this stuff like Atlas, and even various other small developers, both Western, Asian, even Japanese companies who are self-publishing. They're all going out there and they're really utilising this. And the Nintendo Switch especially becoming such an import-friendly console makes it easier, to the point where if you get a game on the Switch, it has multiple languages on the cart, it will load up in the language of your device, so you can have multi-language English physical releases, which is becoming standard for all platforms. This is what I mean when I say Nintendo is the most import-friendly console, because especially compared to the 3DS and the Wii U, the majority of their stuff, their first-party stuff, is multi-language, and this applies to third-party developers as well. The rule of thumb to remember, whether a game has a multi-language release or not, is the game coming out simultaneously worldwide? Or is the game published under the same company? Usually, if it's yes to both those questions, there will often be multi-language option on the cart, meaning that players across the world have the option to buy a game from any region and have it play in English. Of course, this is not universal. Always do your own research, and there are some ways you can get around this, so checking the eShop pages, for example, PlayAsia and other sites that talk about it, and of course talking to collectors, there are ways you can work it out, so do your research. There's also things like Switch Watch where they talk about these things, and that's something else that's really cool. We can spread the knowledge and people will know, and I really like that. Another thing worth noting is some games do get patched later. Some examples of this include Prototype's Visional releases, where some of their older ports have been patched into English to its option, one of which is Butterfly's Poison Bloodchains, which is one of the most popular raunchy otome have an English translation, but it's not just VNs as well, there's other games. As mentioned on a bit earlier, the internet has helped promoted these physical games and these physical releases, so more people are aware about these options. As I mentioned earlier, examples like Night in the Rain and Final Fantasy III, they weren't really well known even when they came out, or even as recently as like a few years ago. But it is becoming more known now because thanks to the internet, we all know about it. And finally, for this bit, you got to talk about how publishers are incorporating it into their business model in ways that goes way beyond just offering it as an option. Of course, I'm talking about limited print companies. The most well-known example is Limited Run Games and their subsidiaries like Super Deluxe Games in Japan and Clear River Games, who they work with in Europe. You've got PlayAsia and East Asia Soft, who use the limited print model to help with localizations and bringing customers to Play Asia. You have companies like Super Rare and Strictly Limited, companies that range wildly with reputations as well, so not just those two but other companies too. They're all part of the business model. It helps guarantee profitability for games, especially smaller indie developers, although you've seen larger companies have used the model to deliberately not do wide retail releases of their stuff and tell people to import. As someone who loves visual novels, I also want to touch specifically on visual novels as well, where the companies that work on this stuff like Prototype and Dramatic Create /Q&A-X, they're the main two, where now they start explicitly marketing Morse language text support as a selling point. For Prototype, you can look at the box art for their games, and if you see a symbol on a corner of the cover that says English or Japanese, or even just reading the back cover to see plain text, if they've got text there saying it's got English, you can switch it. It's multi-language. I mean, it's specifically aimed at foreigners to release stuff and offset the cost, because a lot of physical visual novel releases that companies like Prototype and Q&A-X release just wouldn't be viable for a Western release. Or if they do, they're via Limited Run Games, which Prototype have also assisted with. This isn't universal. Even if a game gets a Japanese Switch port, the translations don't always get included, even when one is available. I can think of a few like Trinaline, for example. That was a visual novel that got released on PC from Manga Gamer, and although that did come to Switch later on, the translation that was done for the PC version isn't on there. Of course, you've got small websites and YouTube channels like previously mentioned Switch Watch promoting import releases with affiliate links. It does help generate views and money for channels, so that's why I'm not going to attack or criticise them for doing this. So, if you're going to buy games, support them. Another example I want to touch on before moving on is about Steam bans. Now, if you're into niche games like visual novels or dungeon crawlers or various other things, you'll know that Steam can be a bit iffy regarding what's allowed on their platform. You can get games from the same developer with the same kind of content, but depending on the reviewer, there are some reviewers that will just go, no, we're not having this on Steam, when it's just blatantly hypocritical. And there are a bunch of reasons why this happens, ranging from Steam's monopoly power right the way through to the fact that so many of the most vocal, quote-unquote, anti-censorship fans online are just far-right cultural pricks. So, any attempts by localization companies who actually understand reality to get these things addressed mean they won't be able to, because Valve, they just have no real incentive to listen to them. Meaning that if you can't get your game on Steam, you're fucked basically on PC. You can put it on other stores like GOG or even adult visual publisher sites, but if you can't get it on Steam, you're not going to get sales. And companies can put their games on Switch or PlayStation to get around these bans. An example of this is 2023's The Curse of Kudan. That port came out. Played through it recently actually. It's a really cool little game with nothing that should really warrant a Steam ban, especially because, again, I've played other games from the same developer, Sukeira Spara on Steam. There's nothing on it that should get banned, but because Steam is so hard to work with sometimes, there's not much you can do but bring it to our platforms. And there are other games that companies who own these IPs haven't quite grasped yet, but bringing their stuff to consoles and pushing the import strategy is how you're going to get around Steam bans. The most notable example, if you're a JRPG fan, is Act Plus's Dungeon Traveller series, which two of the games are not on PC at all. Well, they're on PC but not on Steam, so effectively are not on PC for most people. Yet the first game is, and they've got similar content. It's like, it's just really silly. AC Plus are leaving money on the table by not putting these games on Switch. They're not utilising the import scene. So it's not perfect. Other examples include Nitro Plus, where one of their most critically acclaimed VNs, Full Metal Daemon Muramasa, a custom version was made for Steam, but that's not been allowed on Steam because Valve suck. And you've got this dedicated quote-unquote all ages build that just made, but they can't really sell on Steam now. So, perfect foundation for a Switch port and the import scene. Alright, tangent aside, let's move on. So, what are the consequences of the import scene? I'm going to group this into a few different categories, starting with localization. So, the good aspects that I've already touched on, for the most part, they lower the company's barriers to entry, meaning an English version can happen to begin with. They provide an option to people to import, meaning they don't have to buy limited print. A lot of people do not like having to go via limited run games or similar companies to get games that they believe should be at retail, which I think is pretty reasonable in a lot of situations, especially if it's a company like Sega, Bethesda, and Microsoft as well with Hi-Fi Rush. Just so many large companies releasing stuff via limited prints that should have come to retail, and you can tell it's clearly designed to profiteer and take advantage of the collector market. It's understandable to a point because collectors will pay good money, and it does help ensure a game is profitable, and this is especially beneficial to small indie developers. Bad aspects though is you can use limited prints and the import scene to save money cutting corners by not doing Western releases, when as a large company they can clearly afford to do so and take the financial hit. Capcom is an example of this. People have become so normalised for importing Capcom games that Capcom are likely happy with the model now because they know that people who don't want to buy their games digitally in their regions, especially in Europe, are just going to import anyway, so they make more money from people importing. Square Enix, they're another example where a lot of their releases have been exclusive to Asia but not the West. Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster was quite a notorious one, where until they announced a recent re-release, the most accessible way to pay for Final Fantasy 1-6 physically on the Switch was to import from Asia, rather than a proper Western retail release, which, to their credit, they have acknowledged this mistake, and they're going to be releasing the games properly in October 2024. But there are other examples too, titles ranging from various Day Life right the way through to Saga Scarlet Grace. All titles that could and should have been released physically in the West, they have chosen not to do so. Another aspect that worth touching on is about the translations. Now, a lot of people who will import are generally willing to be more forgiving of localizations that are a bit not perfect, because if you're localizing text aimed at people who don't speak English as a first language, you're going to get more mistakes, because non-native English speakers they won't fully grasp the language. They just will miss things that native speakers can. That's not malicious, but it does mean that more things will slip through, especially when you're trying to sell games to people in the West. A well-known example of this is Sword Art Online Hollow Fragment. When that was originally released, that was exclusive to Asia at first for PS3 and Vita, and the translation for that version was considered to be quite bad. And Bandai Namco, when they brought the game to the West for Hollow Fragment, the PS4 port, which was digital only by the way, they've retranslated the game for PS4 because the original translation for Asia, while that may be acceptable for people living there, is not for a Westerner who are more likely to understand English on a native level. But there are other examples. Vision novels is another big one. Dramatic Create, Cune X, when they first released Ephemeral, Fantasy on Dark, that had a really bad translation, which is still that's still not been fixed. Another more recent example is Edia releasing Hanakare Flower and to Bloom, or Him the Smile and Bloom in Japan. That translation's much better, but you can still tell it was done by a non-native English speaker. At the time of recording this, they've not announced a Western release, so it's possible that they've made that translation specifically for hardcore Otome fans to just import if they want to, but it's not in the West. And also, because I'm going to get comments, no, this has nothing to do with a culture war. There are people that will engage in bad faith about this online. These questionable translations, they're not designed to bypass localizers or political agendas or AI. It's because it saves money for the companies. Is it bad that they don't do it natively with proper native English speakers? Yes. It's not for cultural reasons, it's because they're trying to save money. And it's as simple as that. Now we're moving on to the sustainability aspect of the video. So for this section, I'm going to have some statistics, which I'm going to read off a prompt to make sure I get them correct. So take it away, me, before recording this. All the increased packages from video games shipments abroad lead to increased flights and contributing to an aviation industry that is a major contributor of the climate crisis. 2.5% of total emissions come from aviation. Even though aircraft are becoming more efficient, higher demand means higher emissions, and this includes both people and cargo. There are also cargo airlines. Another thing worth touching on specifically is plastic pollution, as many physical games and merchandise is made from plastic. From National Geographic, production increased exponentially from 2.3 million tonnes in 1950 to 448 million tonnes by 2015. Production is expected to double by 2050, and every year about 8 million tonnes of plastic waste escapes into the ocean from coastal nations. That's the equivalent of setting 5 garbage bags full of trash on every foot of coastline around the world. Moreover, plastics often contain additives making them stronger, more flexible and durable, but many of these additives can extend the life of products if they become litter, with some estimates ranging to at least 400 years to break down, and this is very much relevant to video games. So yeah, if the stats don't make it clear, that's a lot of waste. And while physical game cases are only a small part of all this plastic waste, the culture of consumerism, FOMO, and encouraging people to just buy from other regions is integral to building this vast quantity of waste. And nowadays, all physical games are made of plastic cases and discs, so it's pretty important to understand this. While an all-digital future won't happen, we'll still get physical games. There's still going to be lots of waste, and it will still take decades and even hundreds of years to fully break down. It's really something people need to be aware of. Another aspect I want to touch on relates more to the Japanese retro gaming scene, because this is something that has become increasingly controversial, especially this year, when it's not post-pandemic, but a lot of people think it's post-pandemic, when quote-unquote post-pandemic tourism means people going to Japan are just buying more shit and taking it home to sell on eBay. Tourist hotspots in places like central Tokyo, games there have had to increase in price significantly because of all the tourists coming to buy stuff. The shelves have been cleared out by foreigners looking to scout back home. There was a viral thread by Oliver Gia a few months ago, which I'll have on screen, that really talked about this. There's also a Reddit post I'm going to read now that explains this from a perspective of someone who lives there. After the tourism boom in the 2010s, the drain started. People buying the more popular titles as souvenirs and then taking them home to their home country. If you ever get bored of it, which most people inevitably do, there is no way for them to resell it to make it back into the shop ecosystem here. And so, as the rate picked up and the tourists outpaced the local people selling, the stock began to slowly dwindle. It has been getting into a sorry state for a while now, but there were still some gems to be had, and it was cool to see. Well, this year with the weak yen, it has gone beyond breaking point. On all 4 occasions I've seen American and European people standing in the middle of the shops. With eBay etc. open, checking the local prices, the exchange rate, they're filling their baskets with everything they can get. It's now completely a scalper operation due to how cheap the yen is, and there's nothing left due to these resellers. You can probably pay off your vacation this way, or well, you could, but now the shelves are simply full of the remaining low quality, unboxed, tobacco, yellowed random crap now that no one wants. And they look more like some kind of garage junk sale. I want to touch a bit on my own experiences a bit when I went to Japan and was buying games, because I went to Japan, for those who don't know, in 2017, 2018 for a year abroad. I studied in the north of Japan, so out of the way of the big major tourist hotspots, so areas that you're more likely to find for genuine deals and will be locked off to the average tourist. Most people that visit the shops there like book off brand new game shops in Aeon Mall, which is a national chain. All these other things of Japanese games where if you're just the average Tokyo tourist you're not going to find easily. Most people that visited back then to these shops were Japanese people or Western exchange students, especially the area I was in. The deals I got were good. I got some noteworthy games, some of which I've still got, such as my Doraemon Right to Learn game for the 3DS, as well as my copy of Tomodachi Collection for the Nintendo DS. This was part of a very sustainable selection, as back then it was mostly still for the 3DS and the Vita. The Switch had just come out, didn't even know a full shelf at that point. It was really cool, and to be honest, just hoover up so many Japanese-only exclusive games for these systems that were still getting games, they were still being supported, but it was clear that the writing was on the wall and people were going to move over to the Switch in 2018 especially. I did notice the PSP section was already cleared out, and most of the games left in the PSP section in 2017-2018 by that point were Otome visual novels. Yep. You think the Vita Like, the Vita's got loads of VNs, but at the time the balance was more like 50-50 for VNs and non-VN games, especially anime games. But for the PSP, what that selection was then is what it's like for pretty much everything now. It was all otome games, all games that you need to know Japanese to read, and all games that are also quite niche. Anything like RPGs or something that the average Westerner who's not into otome games would like, they couldn't get that in the selection I had. That was kind of sad. And even as someone like me who likes otome games, I just did a video about Q Parasite, which has done really well. Thank you so much, by the way. Even as someone who's done otome game videos and loves otome, it was kind of sad seeing that if it's not into otome, there's nothing for you anymore. And it has gotten a lot worse in recent years. And while I've not been back to Japan, I feel confident saying that. And especially emphasised by all these import games, because PSP games, especially visual novels, and even Vita as well, most of them will not have English. So it makes sense that Westerners wouldn't want them, but now it's for everything. And even games that don't, people will just buy them because it's cheaper. And speaking of money, it's worth touching on finances now as well. This is similar to limited print companies. Importing is bad for your finances. Things like FOMO, limited editions, paying more for shipping and import tax, even things like discounts and heavy consumerism, all of it factors in. It costs a lot more money and it's a huge financial drain. And people who have this compulsion to collect and just have as much stuff as they can, and premium editions, bonuses that aren't available in the West, as mentioned, like non-game items that are included with games also count, because if you want the gaming stuff, you're going to have to pay more for it as well. Even if it's pre-order bonuses from Japanese retailers, they can be ridiculous with their pre-order bonuses. And sales are also a bit more infrequent as well. With Japanese gamers, usually if a game is great, it's going to stay full price for a long time. But if a game is absolutely shit, the price will drop like a rock. Or if you look at reviews and you just see lots of one-star reviews, and it's a bit less forgiving compared to the West, let's just say. And that's when they'll fall, but otherwise they won't fall. Where it's different to the West, where eventually they'll drop anyway. If you're importing games in 2024, the best way to get discounts is actually to buy from sites like Surugaya or using forwarding services like Buyee, which isn't the most accessible, especially if you really struggle keeping on top of all these things. But it's becoming more expensive to import, and that's because Japanese companies know that more people are going to do it. You have to shop around for the best deals. And this is going to bring me on to engaging in importing a bit more sustainably. Now, I touched a bit more about sustainable game collecting in another video, which I'll have on screen and linked below, but not so much about importing and collecting games, especially if you're going to travel there. And much of what I want to talk about ties into another concept called sustainable tourism, which is basically tourism, but being more aware of the impact you're having on the environment around you and making steps accordingly. In sustainable tourism, these can include things like sustainable travel, so traveling flight free, but also things like only supporting local businesses, avoiding chains, and even not going to places at all when locals tell you not to go. Hawaii is a well-known example of this. But in terms of video games, but also because a lot of people don't really think about it in that direction. So if you're buying games in other regions, here are some ideas you can do to do it more sustainably. The first big one is, of course, going there in person. And when you go in person, if you go to buy for your own collection and what you're going to play, that's okay, because it's for your collection, you're going to keep it, and if you do decide to sell it, you can put it on eBay later on. But even then, you've got to be careful, because if you just buy and haul everything, like the Reddit post said earlier, you can't put it back into the local ecosystem unless you bring it back to Japan. So it's about striking this balance between satisfying your own collection, and if you're going to take a game out of the Japanese ecosystem, make sure it's something you're going to play. Leaving games behind for locals, especially Japanese people, as well as the global south more generally. Like if you're traveling to other parts of the world where the game market is a bit smaller and more limited, and where even if the games are cheaper, it's good practice to leave games behind. Don't just get games there because it's cheaper to sell. So it's not just Japan, it's the global south as well. As a tourist, you have a responsibility to be more sustainable. Just like when it comes to nature and culture, the same applies to goods as well. If you are in the global south, I'd love to see some first-hand perspectives on this, so if you are, please let me know in the comments down below. Next point, do not buy from scalpers online or in person. Sticking to trusted private sellers or independent gaming stores is the best option because you're still supporting a local economy. There are some other examples of stores, so like PlayAsia is a national chain which does operate in Southeast Asia but isn't an independent business. I remember back during the Vita days, there was a store called Heavy Arm. They were a small Malaysian business that really benefited a lot from some Vita fans importing from them. That was how I got my copy of Oroshica actually. I imported it from them directly. I believe they're still going. If they are, I'll leave a link to them in the description as well. There are other companies like them as well. There's Generation Games Singapore as well. That's another one from Singapore. There will also be European ones as well, and American ones. There are loads of independent stores. I'm sure you can find them, whether it's in your home country or abroad, wherever you're traveling to. And of course, there are conventions and collectors as well, buying them from each other. That's also more sustainable because you're supporting your local community. And that is something that is strongly encouraged to help build more. Like, if you have good connections with people, you're less likely to want to take the piss and be unsustainable. So that also works. And then finally, if you do buy online, buying from local importers that are already in the country is a great way to do it. Even buying from Amazon when it's already in the country is still better for the environment than buying from Amazon halfway around the world. I know that's a bit hypocritical of me, but Amazon, Japan, their stuff, this does not stop there as much because it's all really niche. Importing in bulk, paying taxes up front, both of them save money, and also using affiliate links and supporting small organisations. There are other things too, because it's not just about ordinary consumers, it's also about companies as well. Companies also have a responsibility to decrease the demand for certain imports by making better business decisions to begin with. Square Enix are a good example of this. I already mentioned the Pix remasters, but even things like Final Fantasy 7 and 8. That was previously an import exclusive to Asia, but now that later came to Europe, so you can get 7 and 8 on a cart in Europe. Romancing Saga Mithril Remastered is getting a re-release in 2025 in the West via Red Art Games. I'm hoping there's more Saga games after that. It's one example. Final Fantasy X and X-2 on the Switch. X-2 is digital and it's limited to the cartridge. You have to have a cartridge slot in there as well to play it, which is really weird for the Western version, but the Asian one was released properly. It's really strange. That was a bad decision that should have been avoided. Atlas with the Persona 3 and 4 remasters, that speaks for itself really. That should have been retail. There was no excuse not to do that. I heard a rumour from some Megating content creators who posted about it on Twitter that apparently the Persona 5 Royal Limited Edition that was on Shop Atlas sold poorly, so they didn't do it. That's not verified, but I wouldn't be surprised because Atlas make bad decisions sometimes. To their credit, they have started doing things like H1C Origins Collection, where that became a popular import from last year. I own it, it's a great import for a great trilogy of games. Should have been released in the West as well, but better that than via limited run as separate releases. And I say this as someone who probably would get H1C free if it came out on its own, because I love H1C and H1C is amazing. Some of the other things as well range in things I've talked about in my previous sustainable game collecting video. So things like the regulatory angle, banning code-in-the-box releases and all those other things, restricting what can get physicals. All things I've gone over already, go watch that video if you've not already. And I guess the general consensus for importing specifically, only games that make sense to be exclusive to imports, especially visual novels and indie games, they are what should be import exclusives, not games like Square Enix RPGs that should have come to retail. I think that's something else that really needs to be actioned on in video games. I finally want to touch on something to really acknowledge the bigger picture, because if you know much about importing or import yourself, you may not quite grasp how niche importing is. While importing is certainly more accessible than ever, it is still really niche. A lot of people refuse to do it. There's a lot of stigma around it, mainly relating to tax and shipping, which is what I found, which is really strange because when you know what to do, it's a bit of a non-issue, as long as you plan accordingly. But a lot of people, they won't do that, and they will just see, oh, you've got to import, or just buy it from Britain, or America, or buy it from your country of origin, and just not caring. And of course, if you're not into niche games, then of course importing doesn't make much sense to you. Like, as a visual novel fan, importing makes sense to me. As a JRPG fan, importing makes sense to me. If I liked crappy blockbuster Western AAA games that cost $70 billion to make, of course I'm not going to be super interested because it'll probably get a physical release that I am. So it makes sense, and it could also be extra hassle. And I say this as someone who's had issues shipping stuff abroad and shipping stuff to my home halfway around the world. I've had good and bad experiences, mostly good, but I get some aspects why people won't want to do that. Even things like wanting matching localized releases. Like, it's really weird to me that there are people out there who will only buy games if they're ESRB or PEGI rated. That makes no sense to me. Like, a lot of people prefer it because they want their spines to match up and things like that, but it doesn't make sense to me. But I guess it's a mainstream position. I don't know. And also worth touching on that, even for regional publishers that only publish in one part of the world, ranging from companies like Atlas USA up until they open their branch with Sega Europe, to even other companies that are still PAL-centric or other region-centric, like P-Cube, they're primarily European. Rising Star Games, if they're still about, they mostly do European stuff. Japan exclusive publishers, so H2 Interactive, D3 Publisher, Beep, other companies that primarily publish in that part of the world. Cloud Leopard Entertainment, they've had a few exclusives and lots of Falcon ports which they market in English, so they hope people will buy their stuff and play them with bad translations for their bad ports, but I'll save that rant for another time. Limited print companies, of course. Limited Run Games have spoken before how their market primarily is North America and international shipping is just a bonus for people outside who want it, which is why having import releases through the likes of Clear River Games, other European publishers, as well as Super Deluxe Games or Arc System Works in Asia, depending on who does it in that region. It's why having those options is good. And I think it's really important to understand this wider context. And much like the previous video, I finally want to end by saying that I'm not going to say stop importing games or be like, tell you how you should spend your time and money on video games and what you should get. But what I will say is I think that re-evaluating to yourself and the world around you how you'll engage with your hobby, whether it's importing or not importing, or only importing selectively, or only importing games and not merchandise, whatever that is, thinking about it from a more sustainable perspective and how you can help make the world a better place while talking about your hobby and spreading your love for video games. I think asking you to think about that is reasonable, and finding your own answer that can help you enjoy your hobby in a way that benefits everyone around you, and enjoy video games, because games are meant to be played and enjoyed. And if that means buying them from around the world and playing some like Japanese versions like I've done with various games I've had throughout this video, if it means doing that, then so be it, because games are meant to be played and they're meant to be enjoyed, much like the world around us. And that's the tea, really. So I'm going to end it here. I've been going for like 45 minutes now. This video is going to be a fun one to edit, which luckily I'm not going to be having this one up on the channel for a while after filming this, so I've got plenty of time. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, algorithm boosting stuff. Consider becoming a channel member if you would like to do so and can afford to. Anything else you can do to show support would be great. Leave a supportive comment. If you made it to the end of this video, let me know your favourite import from any system, any platform, in the comments down below. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.